I'm now absolutely delighted to welcome writer and researcher Jemma Desai to the Cinema of Ideas. Jemma has curated this month's season, focusing on the relationship between repetition and differentiation in film programming via Alnoor Dewshi's short film, Latifah and Himli's Nomadic Uncle. Tonight, she'll be in conversation with film and cultural relations consultant Jo Duncombe, and they will be speaking about the themes raised in the programme. Thanks so much to you both for joining us this evening. I'm now going to hand over to Jo, and I will be back in about 45 minutes and interrupt you. I'm very sorry to go to the questions.
Thank you, Catherine. Hi, Jemma.
Hi, Jo.
It's lovely to see you here. And it's also, I think, worth sharing that the conversation we're going to have tonight is part of a really long conversation that we've been having over a few weeks since I was first shown the piece that you've shared with us. And I wanted to say, first of all, thank you for sharing the work with us. And largely I wanted to thank you because it feels like a kind of invitation that I and the kind of work that I do have never really received before. It felt like an invitation to come with you into something undefined, into a space that feels a little bit familiar, a little bit like home, but also somewhere completely new. And it felt like a space where I didn't really know what could happen. And that felt really exciting. It felt like it was an invitation not only to share and learn with you, but also to look inwards at myself. And there's this amazing kind of simultaneity, which feels really exciting and unknown. So on that, I just wanted to start, if it's okay, with thinking a little bit about how that invitation landed with me as someone who works like you, kind of in and outside some of the spaces that people might encounter in the world of film. So this role that I'm in tonight, the person you're in conversation with, is a role that's like really familiar to me. It's a role that I've been in many, many times before as part of my job, and it's a role I know that you've been in too. But tonight, this role feels rendered differently, because so often that role is rendered in terms of control and knowingness, and the performance of those things are what are used to measure its success. Has a person mastered what they've seen? Have they controlled the conversation properly? These words of mastering and control are really words of white supremacy, they're words of patriarchy. But this piece felt like a different invitation. The fact that I couldn't define what it was you'd shared, a film or an essay or whatever, meant that I had to start differently. And so it really felt like entering into a space of speculation where there were many unanswerable questions. And in some ways, I found that a bit like it frightened me a little bit, because I'm not used to that kind of invitation. This idea of risk and vulnerability, which isn't only singular but also shared, has become really central to your practice and as a programmer and also as an academic. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you thought about this piece as an invitation.
Thank you so much. That's like so I don't know, it's like really nice to hear you articulate like your relationship to it, and also like I really resonate with all the things that you said as kind of, I don't know, I think they are questions that you ask yourself when you're doing your job as like a professional programmer, but actually I think what you're supposed to do is hide that. Like you're supposed to hide that you weren't sure whether it, like the film that you're supposed to hide behind what other people have said about something, and like actually like your own relationship with coming to know is like hidden. Sometimes when you're a curator or a programmer or anyone that's like introducing something to like an audience, you're supposed to know more than the people that are encountering it for the first time, right? So I think like what you're talking about and what we've done and what we wanted to make present, I think, and what I'm really interested in making present is like the work before the work, like before the work comes to the audience or the panel, like, is there work that's been done before? And often actually there isn't a lot of work that's been done before because of the way that we're programming. Like maybe you're just putting like new releases in your program, and how much work can you really do apart from watch the film? Or, you know, how much of a relationship can you build with a filmmaker, like before you stand on stage at like London Film Festival? Like, so the easiest thing to do when you haven't built that relationship with the work and the person that you're going to have a conversation with is to just hide behind this knowingness and this like formality, and just make the audience feel really safe. Like, I should be here because I know. And I guess that would be a really weird thing for us to do because we've like been friends for a long time, but we've also talked about this for a long time. And also like that weird thing of like being in a situation where you're like working with someone like in public, like having a conversation in public and talking in a certain way where there's like hierarchy just because like you're the chair or I'm the person who's made the work or something. And like that actually then like takes away the fact that we talk in a completely different way if we were just in a different scenario. So I think this idea of invitation like comes in like right at the end of the piece, the performance. I don't know if everyone's seen it, but there's a bit right at the end which is actually something that Kuguru Macharia like spoke at a presentation that they did. They're a scholar based in Kenya. And they talk about method in a really beautiful way, and they also talk about freedom in a different way. And they're talking about method, and but I changed it to programming. And he says this thing which is like, who is gathered for your invitation? And I think like how you like present your invitation, whether it's like the language that you use or the venue that it's taking place in, or the person that you invite to be in conversation with you, will gather different people to do different things. And I think that that's kind of what I heard and kind of wanted to speak to when you asked about the idea of invitation. And also like the invitation of this program, actually, like Cinema of Ideas, and that it was a really open invitation, and it allowed me to kind of, I guess I was like quite anxious about it as well, because I was like, oh, I haven't done any programming for like ages and I don't even know whether I want to. And I was unsure also about my relationship to this film, like and so I sort of used it as an invitation to like sit with that discomfort, I guess. And then lots of other things happened in the time that I was like making this, which changed the piece like quite a lot, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But yeah, the openness of an invitation is actually quite rare. And the time to spend on it, and obviously the resource to like invite other people to do work. And I guess like I think the thing that also allows a conversation to be like this is also like our friendship, is that I can just be like, shall we just talk for 2 hours without worrying, oh God, like that's the money that's like run out, like I'm like buying your time. So I think there's all of those things as well that are really important for the background to why the conversations are the way that they are, or invitations are the way that they are in the work that we do.
I think you used the word knowing and knowingness just then quite a lot, but also in the piece as well. And you know, it's coming back to ideas of kind of like you were just saying then about programming. When it's presented in the way that we so often see it, it's like completist. It's like here's something that I know, and I'm going to impart that knowingness to you. And in this piece and through this work that you've done, you're looking at knowing in a very different way. And I think Lorraine O'Grady is someone who's really central to that kind of reconfiguring of the idea of knowingness as something that is gradual, collective, and this idea of also knowing into the future, that you arrive in a space that's full of lots of different ideas and concepts, but but you're also kind of working towards a kind of future of knowing that's different and rendered differently. Can you talk a little bit more about that concept of knowingness and Lorraine O'Grady's influence in the piece?
Yeah, so I'm doing a PhD at the moment. It's practice-based and it's my second year. So I'm supposed to tell everyone what my practice is. And just before I started this, I was just like, I don't know how to talk about it. Like, I actually literally just don't know. And all this summer, I did these writing workshops that were organized by RCA students. So like, I'm funded by this consortium of that's funded by the AHRC, and there's a group of universities under this umbrella of LAP, and the RCA is one of them. So there's all these like really brilliant like artists who are doing PhDs, like practice-based PhDs, and they're like coming to this academic language and they're like, how can I use this to describe my work? This is like awful. So they self-organized these writing workshops over the summer, which I attended, and got some brilliant speakers. And one of them was Victoria Duque-Bully, who wrote Quiet, this volume of poetry, and is just like a brilliant writer and thinker. And she actually talked to us about this volume of writing that collects Lorraine O'Grady, who is a performance artist, who also spent some time in the UK and but is African American. And she writes about her practice in a really interesting way, there's this one performance statement which is at the beginning of the piece, where she talks about like, who is the audience like of your work, and she talks that work can't exist alone any more than the artist can. So she's really talking about her relationship with critics and curators, and what her perception of that relationship is, right? And it's like, she's thinking about it as like people that need the work in order to know themselves better. And also she's not just thinking about people now, she's thinking about people in the future. And we always think that like programmers are the only ones, or curators are the only ones that are thinking about that. But of course artists are thinking about that, and of course artists are thinking about like that connection. And so I was like really interested in this idea that you also, as a curator or a programmer that's maybe like practicing their work in a different way, maybe you're not always like speaking to people now, which is what you're always supposed to think about when you're doing public programming, right? Like, it's like, how many people can you attract to your program? Was it successful? Are you meeting the audience now? Like, is it current? Are you living in the past? Or is it like, you know, all of those types of things, like, is it irrelevant or relevant? And she's talking about speculative practice, about those who will know, like making her work for those who will know. And it really interestingly, I thought about this, and I don't think we've talked about this, is that day that Victoria held the workshop, she's just had a baby as well. And I gave her like a book, like for her baby, which was the book that's at the end of the piece, the one that I read to Lena, that Somaya gave to me before. And I think there's something in that got connected about like those who will know, and this, yeah, I guess like these other ways of knowing as well, like multiple ways of knowing, and different audiences, and different people that you do your work for. And I think that is something that I don't really get to. I think artists talk about it, but like very rarely will a curator or a programmer like talk about that kind of practice as working on different levels. Like, you know, like in activism, they talk about like micro activism, which is like your relational work in your relationships, your intimate relationships, your friendships. And then like stuff on a meso level, which is like small groups and organizations. And then on a macro level, which is like your institutional, like trying to make change at an institutional level. And I think as a programmer, it's actually, you're so tied to the institution, like you're so reliant on what the institution has deemed already important, and you're so tied to like opportunities from institutions and spaces, that actually that micro and macro level, like is like less spoken about, right? There is like, obviously there are like DIY collectives, but in the UK, like so many of them are funded by the BFI, like, you know, like even then you're like, you are reliant on a certain thing, and that sort of like just that relational work, like that one-to-one level, like I don't know, I don't hear that spoken about so much. So yeah, I'm not sure I answered the question. I went everywhere, but
I think
those are some.
it comes into something we discussed maybe yesterday, which is around this idea of like programming as a form of activism, and the way that's kind of become a bit fetishized in the kind of landscape at the moment, but also how it's almost like a benevolence as well of the kind of institution welcoming in an activist language or an activist discourse, but then when it enters into the space, it becomes flattened, it becomes depoliticized, because it has to play by the rules of the space.
Yeah, I think that's like, I mean, yeah, I think that it's something that I think it goes to there's a quote in the piece which is by Dion Brand, and it's about we need like a new cognitive schema, like we need and we also need like a kind of practical way of wayfinding, right? So there's like, we need to think differently about our work, but we also need like material ways to do that. And I think at the moment, yeah, I think there's an attachment to certain things, certain apparatus of programming, but there is like, people are showing different things and they're talking about different things, but I'm not sure that they are particularly doing things differently. So, and there's attachments to old ways of doing things that potentially I think we might need to let go of. And I think this, yeah, I think that's why a lot of the references in this piece are about letting go of like, well, I guess a lot of the references in this piece are abolitionist thinkers, and abolitionist thinkers are kind of questioning our like attachments to reformist ideas. And I think like a lot of our work as programmers are like reforming a system, and that we're actually like on the forefront of making things look like they're changing. Like when you're doing public programming, you can be the person that is the mouthpiece for the organization. So an organization that's been accused of being too white can do a program that makes it look completely the opposite, right? And that's like, you're the person that puts all of that front and center, right? But because so much of the stuff that happens behind the scenes is hidden, what does that mean if you're doing that and like the conditions have like been left unchanged? And I guess like I'm thinking about like attention as well. Like I was like reading this thing by a performance artist as well, like Alan Krapow, I think his name is, and he says that art is paying attention. That's his like definition of art. It's like to pay attention. And I think abolition is also about like paying attention. It's like it's like a creative act. You pay attention to the way that things work so that you can create something new. And I find a lot of inattentiveness in programming. So, and I think there's also this disconnect between how much attention are we really giving to the work, like when we're watching so much of it, or like how much, like as programmers, maybe if you're like paid and you have this expanse of time, like, and you're so greedy, right? We're greedy with desire to show all of this work, and you show it all in this big thing, and you have this huge expectation of attentiveness from an audience that is absolutely not possible. And so I think there's this thing about like, what are we paying attention to? What are we expecting people to pay attention to? And actually, what are we like hiding by this practice of like demanding attention on certain things and not others? Yeah, I think that there's this thing about really paying attention to the practical things that we do, the language of what we do, that I really was interested in thinking about. And in this piece, I wanted to think about what my attachments to it were, because I see a lot of attachments from other people, but like all I can do is like examine my own. And in this piece, like, yeah, like I was attached to being seen, and to be seen, to finding something. And I think this film is really interesting in terms of attention, because if you're not paying attention, you can read it completely outside of its intention. And also it is freely available. Latifah and Himli is like freely available, like online on BFI Player, but I don't know how many people have seen it, so it's like hiding in plain sight. And so because it's so freely available, I've also been able to like use it so many times, and it's kind of always been present. And when I was watching it like this time, I was like, wow, you really weren't paying attention. Like you really didn't know what this was about, and you really made it into what you wanted it to be. And it made me think about how we can do that as programmers.
Maybe you don't think this is connected, but I feel a connection in terms of this idea of how we're paying attention and questioning how we're asking people to pay attention, and how we as programmers, curators might be paying attention. And it really made me think about the way that you ask for us to join you, not just in our thoughts and in our collective thinking, but in our bodies as well. At the beginning of the piece, you ask us to take a break from the screen, you ask us to move our head, to move our eyes, and then you ask us to remember how it feels. So it's not just an invitation to pay attention with our minds, but also to pay attention with our bodies. And in that way, however many times you've seen the film, you will always see it differently with your body. And again, this comes back to Lorraine O'Grady. She says, in order to layer information the way we perceive it, we need the simultaneity we can only get in space. She talks about writing into space, that she perceives herself as a writer, but her medium of expression is bodily. You, at one point in the piece, you say you want to write towards sensation, that you want your ideas to unfold both inside and outside of the body. And that really speaks to kind of the concepts of simultaneity that run throughout the piece. But I want to ask you what it means to you to feel the sensation of your work, and what that means also to you to offer that sensation outwards to people engaging with it.
I think like the starting with the body is something that I'm thinking about a lot, because I think there are demands made of a curator, like, and a programmer, to hold things that actually the sort of container of like a film festival or a one-off screening actually can't hold, right? I was thinking about trigger warnings actually, like and I was thinking about the feeling of alienation when you're watching something that you don't understand, right? Those two things I was thinking about, is like these reactions that you might get when you present a program. One is like, you've shown something completely inappropriate and I wasn't warned, like that this could hurt me in this way. And second of all, I just didn't get it, and so I'm like really annoyed with you that like, how dare you make me feel like this, basically. And I think like both of those things are valid responses, and both of those things, inside both of those, are like political demands of like, like not being elitist, and also attending to like what cinema can do and what art can do, and that it's not a neutral space, right? But what I think is interesting in this moment is that we are kind of tinkering away in these like institutional ways to like hide those things. So we like put up a slide and say trigger warning and expect that that's okay, and like actually what that request for warning or that sort of feeling of like alienation is like, I actually couldn't connect with you because you didn't attend to me, right? And And I think like I'm learning as I'm doing like more somatic work, and this is part of my PhD practice, is that instead of offering a warning, which is basically saying, I've done my bit now, like I've absolved my responsibility, I told you, so whatever's happened to you is not my fault. It's a very like law-like, very institutional way to behave. And it completely shuts down like relation. What if you said, I acknowledge that this might make you feel this way, and I know that, and I want to offer you something that can make you potentially make you feel like you have sovereignty over that feeling. Like, I can't do anything to you, like, you know, this is, you have something inside you that can manage that. And I know I'm not saying that like fixes it, but it's like a different way of relating with each other in that space, right? If you open that space with it basically an offering of freedom, like you're not trapped by this space, you are not controlled by me, like these are the edges of your body, like this is your inside and your outside, and also I care for the inside and the outside of your body, like I'm not just giving you something that like denies that, right? So yeah, I've been thinking with that a little bit, and thinking about that space of relation, like how do you acknowledge it, and how do you not get caught up in this like really like boring, like completely endless conversation about accountability without any sort of connection or relation, right? I think that, yeah, I think that quote that floats around, which is by Saidiya Hartman, about abolitionist poetics, when she talks about like the sense making siege, and I've also been thinking about like I've been listening to this like podcast, Death of an Artist, and there's a curator, Helen Molesworth, and she talks about how curators and programmers are essentially like lawyers and judges, like and you know, how can you, like basically they're like deciding what's inside and outside, and they leave out all their workings out, and when something goes wrong, it's their job to be silent, right? Like it's their job to be silent and to hide. And what if you're not doing that? What if you're drawing attention to all of that? And I think one of the ways that you can draw attention to it is by acknowledging the body, acknowledging that it exists. Like part of the silencing is to deny the body. So I think that's like some of my thinking at the moment.
Thank you. I think, you know, it's a little bit poetic that in making this piece, your body became implemented in the piece because you were going through a kind of rehabilitation process with your foot, at the same time that you were building this piece that focuses on a work that's all about movement, that starts with the shot of a foot as it starts moving. And it made me really think about, you know, what you've been saying about, and you've so often kind of focused in on this in your work, and around how sort of cinemas and formal education spaces and buildings can like impose on the body. And in the moment that you fell on, for those who haven't seen the work yet, that Jemma fell and hurt her ankle, broke her ankle in Bethnal Green underground station, right? And in that moment, you kind of unraveled some assumptions that you may have had about a space, that we think we know certain rules within a space, and our body responds to those rules because we're conditioned to follow those rules. But sometimes those rules betray us, and sometimes there's a rupture that says the space isn't actually working for you. I wonder if like rupture is something that you have thought about as part of the kind of the building of this piece, this idea that a moment can happen with the body that helps us understand not only the material things, but also the kind of systemic things that are imposing on us as we move through spaces and as we try and interrelate with space.
Yeah, I think I've been thinking about this a lot, like since I don't know when I wrote it. I wrote like this piece called The Arts Are in the Sunken Place, and I guess I wrote it in like 2018 or something, but it was like describing a moment in the cinema, like the preview screening of like Get Out at the BFI, and I was pregnant at the time, and like this sense, like this really like embodied sense of like very much being in my body and feeling quite weird about being in my body like while I was pregnant, but also just this heightened awareness of like all of the different things that were going on in that space. So I think I've been kind of thinking with that, like and teaching with that, and I think that was like such a like following that thread was really, really important, like to do with this work isn't for us. And then with this piece, what was really interesting was like I fell over and I was so annoyed, like I was really angry actually, because I had like all these ideas of how I was going to do this piece and I couldn't do them. I was going to like go walking, and yeah, I had like all these ambitions for it, and I like posted something on Instagram, and there's a friend of mine, Adam, like who's a dancer, Adam Moore, wrote back to me and was so kind to me, and I just wanted to like read what he said, and he said that your leg is still there and might teach you what else is there and around you that we don't often have the patience to see. And I think like that kind of invitation to be attentive to what had happened and connect that to the experience was like something that I was thinking about. And then just, yeah, like really weirdly, like there were so many connections with the film, like you said, with like that it was a film about walking and moving and then being like stuck and unable to move, and what that made me feel like. And there were all these things I was trying to articulate. And yeah, it was like, what did my body, I think like my friend Barbie also said to me, like, just try and listen to what your body's trying to tell you. And in a weird way, there was like all this stuff that like all this theory that my body was trying to tell me about this piece of work that I was doing. And it could have never been accessed had this thing not happened. And I just find that stuff so interesting, like as a, like those accidents, right? But they're not accidents. Are they accidents? And I think it connects to the like Lorraine O'Grady thing. It's like, you know, it's almost like maybe your body is showing you something for your future self, something that you had to know or will know, or and maybe like, because you know this whole thing about this ankle was like the ankle break was also like based on an old break, and that lesson wasn't learned then, but it's possible to learn now. So yeah, I think there was something really like interesting about that happening. And I, you know, it's also like this curiosity, I wonder what the piece would have been if that hadn't happened. But there were so many things.
Sorry,
no, go on.
I think it also makes me think about how your work is interrogating like the concept of linear time, and also saying that what you take from something as you enter a space of unknowingness with a willingness to become more knowing, what you have in that moment is very specific, and it's not complete, and that you might you might make something like this again in a year or 5 years time, but because of what's happened now, there's a progression, but it's also kind of reflexive. It's looking forward and looking back, and it just says so much about the sort of radical practice of looking at time differently, looking at knowingness as something that doesn't stop and isn't held in any singular moment.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. It's making me think about like, you know, when you have like your CV and you say like all the like programs that you've done and all the places that you've done them in, and I just always think about all the different people that I was, and I guess that's what, you know, that's what this piece is about. And I think like, I don't know if other people think like that. I don't know. I wonder if I'm like doing programming wrong because I like think like that. But like, there were so many different versions of myself, and there are so many different things that I didn't know and then did know at different times. So yeah, I think that like that sort of like what you decide to remember and what kind of like description of your work or your practice like changes over time, and yeah, the layering of time I think is really important to think about. And I don't know, like when you're like trying to express like your career, all the things that you've done, like can you express that? That's so hard to express.
I think this feeds into this idea of like classification, and you know, we're coming to this conversation at a point where BFI have just done a big revote on the poll for the best films of all time, and the act of classification has this kind of sense of finality, this sense of like completism, that you can get to the end of a list and to be kind of knowing, or one rung higher on that ladder of having complete knowledge about a particular area of film. But within that structure, even though the kind of discourse around the list is that it's been, you know, it's been shaken up, it's been democratized, there are more voices in the list, there's also this like sense of closure, or, you know, sense that things that get classified become, you know, absolutely the things that you must see or the things that you must engage with, and it doesn't leave space, a list, for you know, looking back and forth and changing how you respond to things at different points. You know, like you're saying that, you know, there are so many different versions of yourself and so many different versions of your body, and so to have this idea of a kind of singular way of classification feels really, really difficult and problematic.
Yeah, I think the thing that I was thinking about when like in, you know, like today, when, because we talked earlier today and then there's been this gap, and I was like looking back at our notes, and it was making me think about the bit that I highlight like right at the end, which is from the like from Changing, the book that I read with my daughter Selena. I think it's something like that life is like physical and emotional osmosis, like that, you know, that it's like this constant exchange, and I think in these lists like that osmosis is like lost, like the experience of life is like quite lost. And I think, like, you know, we've talked about this, but like I think that's was really expressed really to me when like they read out that Chantal Ackerman like was really like against these lists. And I think what was really interesting about like the sort of reading out of that email and that kind of, I don't know, it's like it's like how these lists like neutralize things, depoliticize things, like, and I was thinking it really depoliticized like desire, like political desire, right? So she's like talking about, I don't want to do this is like school, like this is not something that I, you know, want to participate in, and yet she is not made to, but like is part of it now, and she's at the top of it now, and she never asked for that, like, you know, crowning, and like and I think it's like this moment where we want both, like we want to shake up the canon, but we also still want to say that the canon is important. And you know, we kind of want to apparently like treat filmmakers differently in the future, but then we like neutralize their past demands in the present. And I don't know, I think it's just like a really interesting like moment of like, what exactly are you doing? Like, what is it exactly do you think she wanted? Do you think it's just funny that she said that, like in her funny broken English? Like, is that just hilarious, or is there something more? And, you know, like there are lots of ways to read that. It could be that, you know, you're like just drawing attention to the fact that this is something that needs to change if it's truly going to be, you know, truly going to hold like radical and feminist voices. But then it's framed in this like huge celebration of it and this huge like spectacle of it. And I just wonder about these moments where like we seem to want all of it. Like we want the change, but we also want the structure. We want the thing that makes us feel safe. And yeah, I guess that goes back. I think that maybe is to do with connected to the yearning question that is like in the piece, is like it's like, how do you hold on to that thing that you want that everyone tells you can't have, like, and that everyone tells, you know, kind of just doesn't listen to when you're talking and continues to email you and asks you to do it anyway, right? Like, how do you care for that?
I think earlier you used the phrase the fetishization of refusal, right? That she in her the fetishization of refusal, like she's refusing and yet the refusal becomes consumed by the system in a way that makes the system be able to kind of engage with radical discourse but also flatten it at the same time. So the radical discourse itself becomes commodified as part of something that almost is used as a tool to justify the process of entering someone's radical filmmaking and radical thinking into a space that she didn't think she believed should even exist in the first place. It's really fascinating. It's fascinating in relation to your rumination on ideas of kind of expansive spaces that don't have answerable questions in them, that are kind of populated by questions that linger and questions that require continuous return and repetition, which is, you know, part of your relationship to the film Latifah and Himli.
It's also like what they're doing in the film, right? Like they are constantly passing back like a definition, like they're just like, no, not that, not this, not this, not that, and it's this constant movement. And I think like, yeah, I think what's interesting about like my relationship with that film and maybe like how that connects with this list, like, is that we're all implicated in fixing something in a place, and actually sometimes that can be a really politically neutralizing act, right? Like you're fixing something and saying this is what it means, and you're not allowing it to show you like how it could change what you're doing, because you won't change what you're doing, and all you can do is like describe it. And I think this other quote, like the Catherine McKittrick's one, which is really based on like the teachings of like Sylvia Wynter and many others, like description is not liberation. Like I think about that a lot, like in lots of different areas of my life, but specifically in the ways that I asked for space as a programmer and also asked for space in my career was a lot about describing, like, and I think there's a lot of that, like as minoritized like programmers especially, describing the issue, describing the problem, and you get caught in that act of describing when you're not actually allowed the space that you're told you are. You're actually allowed a very small space in order to describe it over and over again. But if you're actually to like move into the big expansiveness of freedom, then you wouldn't need to describe, and there would be something else. And I'm not that person that's like, oh, I wish I could just like, you know, we should be afforded the same freedom as like a white curator or whatever. I'm not saying that. I'm like, I'm not sure that any of us are free, but like, I think this particular thing about being like fixed as a minoritized programmer and the ways that you define yourself or invited to define yourself are really constrictive and really descriptive. And I think it's like it's a mutual, like a reciprocal practice, right? We need to like ask for different things, but we also need to be given the space and the like understanding to be met when we're doing different things. Hi, Catherine.
Hi, sorry. I hate interrupting because it's like fantastic.
Came in a good point.
I said, join in. I want to join in now. I love I'm loving your conversation about lists and the lists, and I obviously have my own the reaction to the list is fabulous. But I think we have some questions. So I'm just gonna so this is from Amy Fun. What is the difference for you between cinematic experiences and performance art experiences related to your discussion on relationality? Oh, I think that's so interesting because I wondered about that as well.
Thank you so much, Amy. And just to say that Amy Fung's book, Before as a Critic, I Was a Human Being, is like so like really made me think a lot like about this last point that we made about like, you know, how do you as a minoritized like person, like what is the relationship between the personal and the political, and I think actually this is related to answering this question, because I always like programmed when I was doing I Am Dora. I always did this really subjective like introduction which talked about like my relationship to the work, and it was so interesting because it really embarrassed people. Like what I realized was it really embarrassed people. It made people feel like, some people seemed to feel really sorry for me, and like really, it's almost like I'd like got naked like on stage, and but then the film could have any like kind of trauma in it, and I think there was like this immediacy to like the work, that because people hadn't been warned that immediacy was going to happen, it was really disorienting for them. I don't have like loads of like experiences of performance art actually, and I don't have lots of like knowledge about like even thinking about my practice as performance, but I'm coming to realize that that's what was happening, and actually it is always happening, right? I'm also really interested in just like all of our obviously all our interactions are performative, especially in these like constraints, but I think there's something about like, you know, when you're in really formal settings like film festival settings, you don't acknowledge that it's a performance. You don't acknowledge that you are embodying like authority, and maybe for me like I was embodying vulnerability, and that maybe that's the difference between like performance art and like the weird performance art of being a professionalized programmer, is like this lack of vulnerability, and like this actual also like, no, you're not allowed to be vulnerable because actually you might make people in the audience think that you shouldn't be up there. That's kind of the sense that I got sometimes, was like, oh God, like you can't say that you're not sure, because then like how can you be there?
Really interesting. I mean, we have another question which is kind of quite similar, but well, not similar, but about some of the same things, which is Jemma, I was really interested in you saying you hadn't done much programming recently, and I wondered how you'd found it, like this experience, given that you hadn't done so much of it. And is performance something that you are much more interested in these days compared to programming?
I haven't done much programming recently. Like the last sort of big bit of programming that I did was Berwick, which was like a year and a half ago. But I talk about programming all the time, and like I teach and I think about it. So I think it's more about like desire, like can and yearning, and thinking about like where can I express that. And also I have a lot of questions, right? Like I have a lot of questions about like language, about positionality. Like I would love to like do a bit more like research and programming around like Indian filmmaking and the kind of Indian filmmaking that we like, that circulates. But it's also like at the moment I'm like thinking a lot about like what's happening politically in India and what it means to show certain types of work. And so I think there are times when you just have a lot of questions about what you're doing, and I think like it's less like that it's over, it's more like, how do I want to do it? That's what I'm thinking a lot about. And I think with performance, and I, you know, like I don't know about this term either, like it's just a useful term for now, like, but this thinking out loud or this writing in space or like this layering of information or whatever is like a helpful way to like sit with questions. I don't know that I can present a program and at the same time say I'm not sure if I should be showing this in that way. So maybe that's also this thing with the differentiation between like cinematic experience and performance art experience. Like can we show something and really hold a lot of questions, or do we have to enclose something? I'm thinking a lot about that.
Thank you so much for sharing Latifah and Himli's Nomadic uncle with us. I was thinking about what you said about, you know, it's here, it's here, but of course lots of people haven't seen it, which is the kind of the paradox, isn't it? Which is the kind of tension between it's there, but we don't know it. And I was really interested in what you were saying as well about how this idea of fixing, you know, that kind of programming is fixing, or quite often it's about fixing our relationship with something. How did you feel? Well, obviously your whole piece is about how you feel about it now. I'm just interested in because I have watched it lots of times before, but then I watched it again because of this, and for me it was also so different. I wasn't even thinking about the kind of programming. I was just so struck by how resonant it, you know, what an amazing piece of work it is, and like I feel like it could have been made, you know what I mean, at any time, at any point. And it made me think about Jo talking about the lists as well, about what we think of as something that's classic, or, you know, or in the canon or whatever. And anyway, I just was interested to hear about what you felt about it watching it now.
I think it's really interesting that like it's a direct like address to the questions that were being asked in the 90s, and is a direct address to like the rubbish conversation that we have about representation now still. And I think that it was also like really interesting to me to be like, oh wow, I also bought into that conversation, like I was also part of this, like this is like an unresolved conversation, it's like this game of ping pong that's in there. That really came across to me. And I think this process of like just letting the film like loop in the background while I like kind of thought with it was also this like, I don't know, it was an exercise in like risk, I think, as well. It's like, is this film going to back me up in what I'm thinking? And sometimes it did, and sometimes it didn't. And like, you know, those pauses of just like, and I think that's also what this is about as well. Like the film is about, you know, it's like, you want to be able to explain this thing, and actually it's hard to explain because there are so many different reasons why people have come here and stayed here and left, and different people feel differently about it. And yeah, I think that I think it's still relevant because there's still things that nobody wants to talk about, or like talk about how they're implicated in, and it is really clever, isn't it, the way that it's done, and it's also really like irreverent. And then you know, like I showed it to some students recently and they were like, I don't understand it, it's like really alienating. So I think there's like all these ways that you're like, oh, actually there's like so many different layers to it, and it does invite like repeat viewings. Like I think it is a film that invites repetition, and I think it wasn't just like letting it loop on repeat that showed me that.
And we've got like 1 minute left, and somebody has asked this question that I think you won't be able to answer. And maybe this is something for the dialogue between you and Jack, because I'm just thinking is, hi Jemma, thank you for the talk. I wanted to ask if the radical work you describe is possible within the institution. And that's from Turab Shah.
Hi Turab. I just wanted to say one thing, which is like there's a piece which I think I gave to Dan, they can put it in the chat, which is a piece about being a curator by Irene Ravel. And in it, they talk about how it's impossible to be an outsider curator, right? Like as a curator, you're always implicated in the activities of the institution. And I think that's like a really interesting thing to look at. But also in that piece, they talk about that they have desires to work otherwise. And so I guess like the work, I don't know what you mean by the radical work I described, what particularly you thought was like radical about it. But I think what's interesting is like we can all do this work, because it's not about inside the institution, it's like inside ourselves. Like, it's like the question of like, why do you want to do what you do? What attachments do you have to these things? And be really honest about that. Like, actually, I want to stand on a stage and be famous, and I want everyone to think that I hang out with famous people, or I want everyone to think that I'm really clever. And that's fine. That is your desire. Like, embrace that. But if you're like searching for something different, then you have different constraints, and then maybe then you want to think about working differently, or maybe you don't want to do that work at all. I don't know. But I think it's like, the work isn't inside the space of the institution. I think it's inside the space of our bodies, and like and between each other, like that honest conversation with each other.
Okay, brilliant. Well, that was amazing, actually. That was like 2 minutes. You answered it. So I'm really sorry, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm going to have to stop it there. So I'd really like to thank Jemma and Jo for amazing conversation this evening. There is something else coming in this season that we haven't made live, so do keep an eye on the Cinema of Ideas platform, and it will be there, which will be a conversation between Jemma and Jack Kaitan about some of the things that we're talking about here and the film, and some of the things from her performance. But until then, thank you so much for this evening. It's like fantastic to be in your company, and thanks everyone for joining us tonight.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Catherine.